There are exactly 853 chapters in the Protestant Bible. Theologians have dissected nearly all of them. Seminaries have built entire curricula around them. Preachers have returned to the same passages thousands of times, mining them for comfort, for doctrine, for hope. And yet, there is one chapter that has survived for over 3,000 years in near perfect silence. Not because it is obscure, not because it is difficult to understand, but because what it contains is so deeply disturbing that the religious world, by some unspoken agreement, decided long ago that it was better left alone. That chapter is Judges 19. And the story it tells is the one we are about to confront together. Most people who have spent years inside a church have never heard a sermon on Judges 19. Ask your pastor, your priest, your Bible study leader. Chances are high that they will pause, that something will shift behind their eyes, and that they will offer you a careful, measured reason why that particular passage requires special context. The story of the Levite and his concubine does not fit neatly into a narrative of a loving God and a chosen people walking in righteousness. It fits into the story of what happens when a society loses its moral center entirely and cannot recognize itself in the mirror. Before we go any further, we need to establish who the people in this story are. The man at the center of Judges 19 is a Levite. In ancient Israel, the Levites were the priestly tribe, the men set apart for the service of God. The guardians of the covenant, the ones responsible for instructing the people in the law. His companion is described by the Hebrew word Pelegesh, a concubine. She has no name in the text. In 3,000 years, no one has given her one. She is simply the Levite's concubine, and that namelessness is itself a statement about how the world she lived in valued her. The violence in Judges 19 does not happen among foreigners. It happens in Gibeah, a city belonging to the tribe of Benjamin, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. The people who commit the act are Israelites. Israel, at its lowest point, becomes indistinguishable from the cities God had already destroyed in fire. Because Judges 19 is not in the Bible to comfort us. It is not there to inspire us. It is there to bear witness, to hold a mirror up to what human communities are capable of when they stop asking the question that every just society must never stop asking. Who is being harmed, and what are we willing to do about it? That question is as alive today as it was in the hill country of ancient Israel. And the silence that has surrounded this chapter for centuries is not just a religious failure. It is a human one. There are exactly 853 chapters in the Protestant Bible. Theologians have dissected nearly all of them. Seminaries have built entire curricula around them. Preachers have returned to the same passages thousands of times, mining them for comfort, for doctrine, for hope. And yet, there is one chapter that has survived for over 3,000 years in near perfect silence. Not because it is obscure, not because it is difficult to understand, but because what it contains is so deeply disturbing that the religious world, by some unspoken agreement decided long ago that it was better left alone. That chapter is Judges 19, and the story it tells is the one we are about to confront together. Most people who have spent years inside a church have never heard a sermon on Judges 19. Ask your pastor, your priest, your Bible study leader. Chances are high that they will pause, that something will shift behind their eyes, and that they will offer you a careful, measured reason why that particular passage requires special context. And they are right that it requires context. But what they rarely say is that the reason it is avoided is not theological complexity. It is moral discomfort of the highest order. The story of the Levite and his concubine does not fit neatly into a narrative of a loving God and a chosen people walking in righteousness. It fits into something far darker, far more honest, and far more human. It fits into the story of what happens when a society loses its moral center entirely and cannot recognize itself in the mirror. Now stop for a moment and think about what it takes to be genuinely ignored by religious tradition. The Bible contains stories of genocide, of incest, of kings who murder innocent men to steal their wives, of prophets who call down fire on their enemies. None of those stories have been hidden. They have been preached, debated, defended, and contextualized for centuries. But Judges 19 sits in a category almost by itself. Biblical scholar Phyllis Tribble, in her landmark study of violent texts in Scripture, called this passage one of the most terrifying in the entire Bible. She did not say that lightly. She called it a text of terror, a story that refuses to be spiritualized, refuses to be resolved, and refuses to release the reader from its weight. The question is, why does a text this important remain so unknown to so many people who claim to know the Bible? The answer begins with understanding what kind of book Judges actually is. Most readers come to Judges expecting something like Genesis or Exodus, a narrative of divine guidance, of miracles, of a people walking imperfectly but generally forward with God. What they find instead is a spiral, a long accelerating descent into chaos. Judges is structured around a pattern that repeats itself with increasing severity. Israel abandons its covenant. Disaster follows. A leader rises to deliver them. Peace comes briefly, and then the cycle begins again, each time worse than before. By the time you reach the final chapters of Judges, the text is no longer presenting Israel as a flawed but redeemable people. It is presenting a society in complete moral collapse. And Judges 19 is the proof. It is the moment the spiral hits bottom. The last verse of the book of Judges, chapter 21, verse 25, states this plainly: "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." That verse is the caption beneath the entire book. But it is also the caption beneath Judges 19 specifically, because what happens in that chapter is only possible in a world where the structures that protect the vulnerable have completely dissolved. There is no law enforcement. There is no court of appeal. There is no institution that a woman with no status and no voice can run to when the men around her decide that her life is worth less than their convenience. What the text describes is not an isolated crime. It is a symptom of a civilization rotting from the inside, and the terrifying part is that every element of that rot is recognizable. Before we go any further, we need to establish who the people in this story are, because the identities matter enormously. The man at the center of Judges 19 is a Levite. In ancient Israel, the Levites were the priestly tribe, the men set apart for the service of God, the guardians of the covenant, the ones responsible for instructing the people in the law. This is not a random traveler. This is not a pagan outsider. This is a man who, by birth and by calling, belongs to the spiritual elite of his nation. His companion is described by the Hebrew word pilagesh, a concubine, not a wife in the full legal sense, but not a slave either. She occupies a middle space, one that gave her some protections under ancient Near Eastern law, but left her ultimately dependent on the man she was bound to. She has no name in the text. In 3,000 years, no one has given her one. She is simply the Levite's concubine, and that namelessness is itself a statement about how the world she lived in valued her. What makes this story almost impossible to process is the geography of the crime. The violence in Judges 19 does not happen among foreigners. It does not happen in a Canaanite city or a Philistine stronghold. It happens in Gibeah, a city belonging to the tribe of Benjamin, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. The people who commit the act are Israelites. The man who fails to prevent it is an Israelite. The old man who opens his door and then closes his eyes is an Israelite. Every figure in this story, with the exception of the woman herself who has no voice, is part of the covenant community. The people who were supposed to be different, set apart, defined by a law that explicitly protected the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. And yet, what unfolds that night in Gibeah is something that the text itself compares to the wickedness of Sodom. Israel, at its lowest point, becomes indistinguishable from the cities God had already destroyed in fire. There is a reason the ancient scribes preserved this story exactly as it happened, without softening a single edge. There is a reason the spirit that guided the formation of the biblical canon did not remove this chapter when it would have been easy to do so. Because Judges 19 is not in the Bible to comfort us. It is not there to inspire us. It is there to bear witness, to hold a mirror up to what human communities are capable of when they stop asking the question that every just society must never stop asking: who is being harmed, and what are we willing to do about it? That question is as alive today as it was in the hill country of ancient Israel, and the silence that has surrounded this chapter for centuries is not just a religious failure, it is a human one. It is the same silence that surrounded the concubine on that road, in that city, on that night. And it is exactly that silence that we are about to break. Every story begins before it begins. Before the road, before the city, before the door and the darkness and everything that follows, there is a relationship. And to understand what happens in Judges 19, you have to understand the relationship at its center, not as we would describe it today, not through the lens of modern categories, but through the lens of the ancient world that created it and the Hebrew language that recorded it. Because the words the biblical text uses to describe the Levite and his concubine are not neutral. They carry weight, they carry history, and if you read them carefully, you will find that the violence of that night in Gibeah did not begin at the city gate. It began long before, in the structure of the relationship itself. The Hebrew word used to describe the woman is pilagesh. Translators render it as concubine, which is accurate enough as far as it goes, but the English word fails to capture the full texture of her situation. In ancient Israel, a pilagesh was a woman bound to a man in a relationship that carried some of the legal weight of marriage, but not all of it. She could not be dismissed as easily as a servant. She had certain protections under the social and legal customs of the time, but she also lacked the full status of a primary wife. She could not own property independently. She had no family structure within the household to appeal to if she was mistreated. She existed in a threshold space, not enslaved, but not fully protected either, and in a world where a woman's safety depended entirely on the status and goodwill of the man she belonged to. That threshold space was an enormously dangerous place to stand. Now look at the Levite. The text introduces him without a name as well, which is itself significant. He is defined entirely by his tribal identity and his relationship to the woman. He is a Levite from the hill country of Ephraim. This detail is not incidental. The Levites were the tribe set apart for the service of God under the Mosaic covenant. They did not receive a territorial inheritance in the land of Canaan like the other tribes. Instead, they were distributed among the cities of Israel, supported by the tithes of the other tribes, because their purpose was priestly and instructional. A Levite was, in theory, a man of the law, a man who knew the covenant, a man who understood better than most what God required of his people in terms of justice, mercy, and the protection of the vulnerable. The gap between what this man was supposed to represent and what he actually does in Judges 19 is one of the most devastating ironies in all of Scripture. The story opens in Judges 19, verse 1, with a geographic and relational note. There was a certain Levite living as a foreigner in the hill country of Ephraim, who had taken a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. The Hebrew construction here is important. Some manuscripts describe the woman as having been unfaithful to the Levite. The Hebrew verb used is zina, which can mean to commit sexual immorality, but which, in certain contexts, simply means to be angry or to act against someone. Scholars have debated for centuries whether the woman actually committed adultery or whether she left the Levite because of mistreatment. What the text makes clear is that she returned to her father's house in Bethlehem. She went home. She put distance between herself and the man she was bound to, and she stayed in her father's house for 4 months. That detail, 4 months, suggests this was not an impulsive departure. Something had broken between them. The Levite eventually goes to Bethlehem to bring her back. The text says he went to speak tenderly to her. The Hebrew phrase is ledaber al liba, which literally means to speak to her heart. This is the language of reconciliation, of gentleness, of a man trying to repair something damaged. And on the surface, it seems like a story of restoration. The father receives the Levite warmly. There is eating and drinking, hospitality, the rituals of welcome. But read the passage carefully, and you will notice something deeply unsettling. The woman never speaks, not once. In 4 days of feasting and conversation between the Levite and her father, the woman who left, the woman whose departure set the entire story in motion, is given no voice in the text. She does not consent to return. She does not refuse. She is simply there, and then she is taken. Her heart, the one the Levite claimed he wanted to speak to, remains entirely unheard. This silence is not an accident of ancient storytelling. The author of Judges 19 is too precise a writer for accidental omissions. The woman's silence is a structural choice, and it mirrors what is about to happen to her on a far more devastating scale. What the text is doing from the very first verses is establishing a pattern. The men in this story speak, decide, act, and negotiate. The woman exists within those decisions without the power to shape them. Her father and the Levite spend days eating and drinking together while her fate is arranged around her. And when the Levite finally decides it is time to leave, he makes that decision unilaterally. He loads his donkeys. He takes his concubine, and they set out on the road that will lead them to Gibeah. Guard this image carefully as we move forward, because it becomes the interpretive key to everything that follows. From the moment the concubine is introduced in verse 1 of Judges 19, she is in motion, but never under her own power. She moves from her father's house to the Levite. She moves back to her father's house. She is brought back by the Levite. She will be placed outside a door. She will be found on a threshold. Her entire existence in this narrative is defined by the decisions of the men around her, and the text records this not to endorse it, but to expose it. Every careful reader is meant to feel the wrongness of it. Every careful reader is meant to ask why she has no name, no voice, no choice. Because the answer to that question is the indictment the author is building, slowly, deliberately, one silent verse at a time. There is one more detail from this opening section that deserves your full attention. When the Levite finally departs with the concubine, her father urges him repeatedly to stay another day. 4 times the text records these invitations to delay, and 4 times the Levite resists or partially relents before finally leaving in the late afternoon, far too late to complete a safe journey. Ancient travelers knew that being on the road at nightfall was dangerous. The Levite knows this. He chooses to leave anyway at a compromised hour with a woman whose safety depends entirely on decisions she has no power to make. And that choice, that one seemingly ordinary decision about when to leave, is what places them both on a darkening road headed toward Gibeah as the sun begins to fall. Some catastrophes do not announce themselves. They begin with a man who simply refuses to stay one more night. Picture the road. Not a paved highway, not a marked route with distance indicators and resting stations maintained by some governing authority. A dirt path winding through the hill country of ancient Canaan, flanked by terrain that could hide almost anything in the growing dark. The Levite and his concubine are traveling with a servant and 2 saddled donkeys, which means they are not destitute. They have some resources, some status, some visible sign of belonging to a class of people who should be treated with respect. But status on an ancient road at dusk is worth exactly as much as the willingness of strangers to honor it. And as the light begins to fail over the hills of Benjamin, the Levite faces a decision that will determine everything that follows. It is a decision that seems minor. It is anything but. They have passed Jerusalem, or rather, they have passed Gibeah, because at this point in the narrative, the city has not yet been taken by Israel. It is still a Jebusite city, populated by people who are not part of the covenant community, not part of the 12 tribes, not bound by the laws and obligations that should have governed Israelite hospitality. The servant suggests they stop there for the night. It is close enough, the hour is late enough, and the walls of a city offer protection that an open road does not. But the Levite refuses. He will not stop in a city of foreigners, he says. He will press on to Gibeah, or perhaps Ramah, cities of Israel, cities of his own people. There is a logic to this that feels almost admirable on the surface. Stay among your own, trust your own, rely on the covenant community that shares your law and your God. But embedded in that logic is an assumption so catastrophically wrong that it will cost the concubine everything. There is a detail in this section of the text that most readers pass over too quickly, and it deserves to be slowed down. The Levite is carrying provisions. He tells the old man who eventually takes them in that they have straw and fodder for the donkeys and bread and wine for themselves. He came prepared. He is not asking for charity in the full sense. He has resources. He has supply. He simply needs shelter and safety. The request being made of the people of Gibeah is not a burden. It is the minimum expression of the covenant they claim to live by. And still, until one elderly man who is himself a foreigner in the city, the text notes he is from the hill country of Ephraim, living in Gibeah, not native to it. Until this one outsider looks up and sees them sitting in the square, no one moves. The native citizens of Gibeah do nothing. The insider community fails completely. It is an outsider again who acts. This pattern, the outsider who honors the covenant that insiders have abandoned, runs like a thread through the entire biblical narrative. It appears in the story of Ruth, in the story of the Good Samaritan, in dozens of moments where the person least expected to act rightly is the one who does. And here, in the darkening square of Gibeah, that pattern appears again in the form of an old man from Ephraim who looks at a Levite and his concubine and says, "Do not spend the night in the square. Come to my house. Whatever you need, I will provide it." It is a moment of genuine grace in a passage that is rapidly running out of them. But the grace of one righteous man in a corrupt city is not enough to stop what the city itself has already decided it wants. The door will open. The travelers will enter. And outside, in the streets of Gibeah, something is already moving toward that door. There is a particular kind of dread that builds slowly. Not the sudden shock of an unexpected blow, but the creeping, accumulating weight of a situation that keeps getting worse in ways you almost see coming, but cannot stop. That is the dread that the author of Judges 19 constructs with extraordinary precision in this section of the story. Everything inside the old man's house is warmth, food, and relief. Everything outside is something else entirely. And the contrast between those two spaces, the lit interior and the dark street, is not accidental. It is the entire moral architecture of the chapter, made physical. What is inside the door represents what Israel was supposed to be. What comes to the door represents what Israel had actually become. The old man from Ephraim welcomes the Levite and his party with genuine generosity. He sees to the donkeys. He brings water for their feet. He sets food and drink before them. The text in Judges 19, verse 21, describes a scene of complete hospitality. Every obligation of the ancient covenant of welcome is fulfilled without hesitation. They are eating, drinking, resting, the strain of the road dissolving in the warmth of a stranger's home. And then verse 22 arrives. It arrives the way catastrophes always arrive in this kind of story, without announcement, without warning, introduced by a single ordinary word that carries the full weight of what is coming. Behold. The Hebrew hine. Look. Pay attention. Something is happening that you must not look away from. The men of the city, certain worthless fellows, surrounded the house and beat on the door. The phrase translated as worthless fellows in most English Bibles is, in the original Hebrew, B'nai Belial, sons of Belial, or sons of worthlessness. This is a significant term in the Hebrew Scriptures. It does not simply mean bad men or criminals in the modern sense. It describes men who have fundamentally rejected the covenant, who have placed themselves outside the moral order, who behave as though no law, human or divine, applies to them. The same term appears in other parts of the Hebrew Bible to describe people guilty of the most severe violations of communal ethics. When the author of Judges 19 uses B'nai Belial to describe the men of Gibeah who surround that house, the reader of the original text would have understood immediately. These are not simply rowdy men who have had too much to drink. These are men who have abandoned their humanity in the most theologically precise sense that the Hebrew language allows. And what do they demand? They beat on the door and they say to the old man, "Bring out the man who came into your house, so that we may know him." The Hebrew verb here is yada, to know. It is the same verb used in Genesis 4, verse 1, when the text says that Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived. It is the verb used in Genesis 19, verse 5, when the men of Sodom surround Lot's house and demand that he bring out his visitors so that they may know them. The parallel is unmistakable, and it is not coincidental. The author of Judges 19 is drawing a direct line between what happened in Sodom and what is happening now in Gibeah. The city of the covenant people has become Sodom. Israel, in the territory of Benjamin, has reproduced the exact moral horror that God destroyed with fire and sulfur. The comparison is not metaphorical. It is structural. It is deliberate. It is an indictment written in the architecture of the text itself. Now consider what the old man does next, because his response is one of the most morally complex moments in the entire chapter. He goes to the door. He speaks to the men outside. He begs them not to act wickedly. The Hebrew word is ra, evil, the most basic moral category of wrongness. He acknowledges what they intend to do, and then he makes an offer that stops most modern readers cold. Take my virgin daughter and this man's concubine. I will bring them out to you now. Do with them what seems good to you, but against this man, do not do this outrageous thing. Read those words carefully and feel the full weight of them. The old man, who performed every act of hospitality correctly, who opened his door to strangers when no one else would, who recognized the covenant obligation that his neighbors ignored, this same man offers 2 women to a mob in order to protect one man. He does not hesitate. He does not seem to experience this as a moral contradiction. In his world, it is not one. This is where the ancient world and its values collide most violently with any reader who brings a modern conscience to the text. The old man's offer reveals something that the biblical narrative has been quietly exposing since the first verse of the chapter. In this world, women are a category of resource that men can deploy in the service of protecting other men. The daughter and the concubine are not people whose safety constitutes a moral obligation equal to that of the male guest. They are instruments. They can be offered, exchanged, sacrificed. And the text records this not with editorial condemnation. There is no narrator voice that steps in to say this was wrong, but with something far more disturbing, plain, unadorned description. The author trusts the reader to feel the horror without being told to feel it. That trust is itself a form of moral seriousness. Now read what the Levite says to her. Judges 19, verse 28. Get up, let us be going. That is it. Get up, let us be going. No recorded expression of horror, no recorded grief, no name called, no question asked, no acknowledgement of what she has been through or what he did when he handed her to those men. Get up, let us be going. The command is not addressed to a person in the fullness of her humanity. It is addressed to a possession that has been delayed. It is the language of a man talking to something that belongs to him and has temporarily stopped functioning. And the text follows those words with 4 of the most quietly devastating syllables in all of Scripture. But she did not answer. She did not answer. Whether she was dead at that moment or so broken that speech had left her, the text does not say. The Hebrew is ambiguous. Scholars have debated it for generations. But the author does not resolve the ambiguity, and that refusal to resolve it is itself a moral statement. It does not matter, the text seems to say, whether she was dead or simply beyond words. He loaded her onto the donkey, and he went home. Stop and sit with that for a moment. He loaded her onto the donkey. The same donkeys they had ridden from Bethlehem, the same animals carrying the provisions he had described to the old man, straw and fodder and bread and wine. Now she is among the cargo. Now she is loaded. The verb the Hebrew uses here, vayakam, describes the physical act of lifting and placing. He lifted her. He placed her on the animal. He did not carry her with tenderness, at least not in any way the text sees fit to record. He loaded her, and he left Gibeah. And at some point on that road, whether before he left or during the journey, or when he arrived at his home in the hill country of Ephraim, she died. Or she was already dead when he lifted her. The text never tells us exactly when. It tells us only that when he arrived home, he took a knife and he laid hold of his concubine and he divided her limb by limb into 12 pieces. And he sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. Imagine receiving it. You are in your city, in your home, going about the rhythms of daily life in ancient Israel, and a messenger arrives carrying something wrapped in cloth. And when the cloth falls away, you understand immediately, with the full force of physical revulsion, that what you are holding is a piece of a human body, a piece of a woman, sent to you deliberately, intentionally, as a message that demands a response. This is what happened across the territory of Israel when the Levite took his knife and carried out the most extreme legal act recorded in the entire book of Judges. 12 pieces, 12 tribes, one body distributed across an entire nation like a summons written in flesh. And the response it produced was immediate, unanimous, and unlike anything else in the biblical record of that era. To understand why this act had the power it had, you need to understand the legal and cultural logic behind it. In the ancient Near Eastern world, the division of a body, typically an animal, and its distribution among allied parties was a recognized form of covenant summons. It communicated something that words alone could not carry. This is what has been violated. This is the severity of the breach, and I am calling on every party bound by covenant obligation to respond as though this happened to them personally. The practice appears in other ancient documents from the surrounding cultures of that period, it was not a private act of madness. It was a public, legally intelligible statement. When the Levite divided her body into 12 pieces and sent one to each tribe of Israel, every recipient understood the language. The question was not what it meant. The question was whether they would answer.